those of you who are married, I want you to think back in time, and I want you to imagine or try to remember as best you can, why? Why did you get married, right? Like, why? What caused it? What were you thinking? I've been married for almost 22 years now, and if I think back, I mean, there's a few specific reasons why I wanted to get married. First of all, I thought she was pretty. That was kind of important to me. That was a big deal. Kind of cared a lot about that, right? Also, she seemed to tolerate me, which didn't seem like there was a lot of other women who wanted to do that, and so that was kind of a big deal. Appreciated that for sure, right? There's more. It wasn't just that. I mean, she's fun, she's exciting, she was unpredictable, she continues to be all of those things. I found my life to be very entertaining around my wife, right? And I anticipated that the rest of my life would look like that, and I thought that sounded fun. And like she loved Jesus, that was important, right? And she made me a better version of myself, which is important. And she could cook. She wanted to be a wife, and she wanted to be a mom, she wanted to raise a family, and those were, appealing things to me. And also, like, she was really pretty. Right? Like, that was just really meant a lot to me, right? I think you could look back at that time, and you could see Christy and I both had at least one thing that was very important. We both had this one thing in common, again, very important. Both of us loved me. And maybe that's why you didn't get married, right? Or maybe that's why you're not married anymore. Maybe you could say something like, he only thought of himself. Or maybe you could say, she never considered my needs. Or maybe you could say, he was rude or mean. Or maybe she was immature or selfish. Because marriages don't work very well when it becomes all about just one of the people in the marriage, right? A healthy marriage has to move past selfishness. You have to be able to move from just being a consumer of the other person to actually being a conduit of goodness back to that person. And yet, that is usually where a relationship starts, isn't it? I've met with a lot of young couples who are wanting to get married, and every single one of them, meaning every single individual, has had one thing in common. Every single one of them is getting married because of what's in it for them. Every single person who gets married is focused on what the other person is going to provide for them within this marriage agreement. And so that's one of the first questions that I ask. Why do you want to marry the other person? And they'll give me their list. Something like, he's so sweet because he always puts me first. And people like being put first, and they want lots more of that, right? Or maybe the guy says that she's just pretty, and I can't take my eyes off of her. And if you're a man and you're attracted to a woman, then that's a really big deal, isn't it? It absolutely pulls you in, and that's something that you want to be able to have for yourself. Maybe she would say, he's so patient, and he listens to me, and he helps me, and that's a beautiful thing. Maybe you would say, she's just so supportive. She likes to laugh at my jokes. That's a big deal. She's boosting your ego. You want more of that. Essentially what I've found, whether it's in my life or in the lives of the people who've made their way into my office, essentially what I've seen is that the other person meets the need that they have. And everyone needs something. You need the ego boost, or you need the satisfaction and the joy of someone who's beautiful, or you want something that's going to hit that missing link, whatever it is, whatever craving, whatever desire you have within your heart. The other person meets it. And to say it like that, it sounds selfish. There's nothing wrong with loving someone because of what they do for you. But that's not a good recipe for a lasting marriage. At some point, a mature person moves from being the receiver of good from the other person, and they become a giver of good. It can't only flow in one direction. It can't only be she laughs at my jokes and she's pretty and I'm getting everything I need. An attitude like that's not going to keep a relationship. It's not going to keep a marriage. unless at some point the man is able to provide something back to her as well. It's got to go back and forth. Marriage calls us to love the other person, not just love what the other person offers. Which means that most people fall in love as consumers. We love what they can do for us, who they are, what they can provide for me and my ego. But if the relationship is going to last, if the relationship makes it to marriage, and if it becomes a vibrant marriage, then a married person has to move from a consumer to a giver. From a consumer of love to a provider of love. It's the same with our relationship with Jesus. We come to Jesus for selfish motives. We need something from him. We need help, or we need a savior, or we need hope for this life and for the next. And the thing is, like Jesus, he's okay with that. He's cool with those terms. He's okay if we come to him and need him. Jesus loves that we come to him regardless of the motivations that bring us there. He's okay with us showing up as consumers. But then he begins the process of conversion in us. Jesus begins changing us over time, usually slowly. Sometimes we're the last ones to find out. If you're in a relationship with Jesus, eventually you begin caring about different things. And what we cared about at the beginning, what we cared most about when we come to Jesus, it just slowly dissipates. We suddenly start caring about something different. Slowly, it becomes less about us and more about him. It starts becoming more and more about him, not just what we get from Jesus, but more about who he is. And that compounds over and over again to where it becomes less about us, and it actually never even anticipate this, but it actually becomes more about the people around us. Slowly our perspective changes. Let me show you what this looks like. In John chapter 6, Jesus has a massive crowd that's gathered around him, and they need to eat. The story is usually called the feeding of the 5,000, but that's not the most accurate way of telling the story. It only counts the men in the story. There's probably 15 to 20,000 people that Jesus feeds with a small lunch that belonged to a boy. It's a crazy story. And it's a life-changing story. If you were there, it would probably change how you'd want to live the rest of your life. Because if you could follow Jesus, you'd never have to cook again. That sounds like a great deal, right? Or maybe like just kind of hang out with him, follow him around. It means you're never going to be hungry again. That's a big deal. Now that night, after they've all had dinner together, that night, the disciples get into a boat and they cross the lake that they're kind of camping out by, and a big storm comes up, and it's the famous story where Jesus walks out on the water to the disciples, and Peter sees it. It freaks him out at first, but then he gets out of the boat to walk on the water, which is really, really cool, but then he takes his eyes off Jesus and he begins to sink. You've probably heard the story before. Now the next morning, the disciples and Jesus are on the other side of the lake. They've kind of run from, in a way, this massive group of thousands and thousands of people. But that group wakes up and they begin looking for Jesus and the disciples, and they eventually find them, again, on the other side of this lake. And when they show up, Jesus knows why they're there. In fact, Jesus calls it out directly. He's very honest with them. He's very upfront with them. And he tells them, I tell you the truth, you're looking for me not because you saw miraculous signs, but because you ate the loaves and you had your fill. Essentially, Jesus is saying to them, you liked dinner and now you're back for breakfast. You loved what happened last night and now you've come back for more. And to be fair, wouldn't you? Wouldn't you show back up the next morning? Wouldn't you be thinking that if we just follow this guy around, that like the rest of our life, we'll never have to cook another meal, we'll never have to provide for ourselves? It's an incredible opportunity. We can just follow him around. We can do whatever he tells us to do, and he'll take care of us, and he's going to meet our needs. Wouldn't you like that? Jesus begins teaching the crowd that's gathered. He tries to get the crowd to believe in him as the Messiah, not just as the bread delivery guy. The crowd goes back and forth with him, and then Jesus breaks out the wild teaching. He tells them, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. That's weird. Should be a little uncomfortable, right? And no one heard this metaphorically. He's talking to a group of people that he literally fed the night before in a miraculous way. And now he's saying, come take a bite out of me. That's exactly how they heard it. Now maybe the crowd thought they misheard Jesus. Maybe they're arguing with themselves kind of in that internal dialogue, and they're like, surely Jesus didn't just say what I think he just said, except that Jesus says it again and again and again. He uses the same language over and over. You can almost feel it as you read through the text. It seems like every time Jesus says it again, it seems like the audience just winces a little bit more. They cringe just a little bit more. And John, who records the story for us, he tells us that a lot of people walked away. I bet they did. Most of us approach Jesus as a consumer, just like this crowd. And when we pray, our prayers usually sound like a Christmas wish list, much more than it sounds like an effort to get in line with the will of God. Our motivation tends to be what we can get from God. And we do the same thing with church. Maybe you don't think you do, but maybe you may recognize it if you've ever heard yourself say phrases like this. I don't like the sermon because it wasn't deep enough for me. Or I don't like the worship because it's not my style. Or the Bible study or the life group isn't really challenging me right now, and so I'm going to go and look for something else. We treat God and we treat God's family like it's some sort of a buffet that was sent to serve my every craving. And it's kind of true. God wants to meet your needs, and the church should want to help you grow, but there's more to it than just simply serving you. At some point, it's not about you anymore. I grew up going to a Christian camp that was up in the Guadalupe Mountains outside of Carlsbad, New Mexico. And not far from our camp was a hiking trail that ended at a place called Sitting Bull Falls, which looks something like that. Right? Now, it was a pretty easy hike. It's a few miles through the desert mountains. There were some challenges. I mean, you had to watch out for snakes, and there were some sharp drop-offs, and there was some jagged rocks and all those kind of things. But all in all, it was the kind of hike that you could take a bunch of young people who didn't have experience, and they could do it just fine, just a couple miles. Now, I grew up, again, hiking this trail so many times that I saw some of the extra stuff off of the trail. I knew of a couple special things that existed. Like there was this one spot, when you did this hike, you would come in at the top of these falls and kind of have to hike down to the pools down below. But up above, just before you got to these falls, there was this split in the trail. And there was the main trail that you took that was much wider and had clearly been traveled more. It's the trail you're supposed to be on. But off to the left was this very simple little trail, very narrow, hardly ever traveled. And I knew that if you take that trail just about 50 yards, it wasn't even very far, just take this extra trail off to the side, you would find an incredible natural pool. Just kind of tucked back in under the side of the mountain. In fact, I tried to find pictures. This isn't it. It was something like that, but this is not even close. Like this thing is so remote, it's so hidden that I don't think a lot of people know it exists. It's kind of covered up by some rocks. It's kind of like it's in a cave, but not really. And in the middle of this harsh desert landscape, there's this pool, this natural spring that just kind of filled up in this area underneath some rocks, and so it's naturally shaded, and the water is just incredibly cold, and it's incredibly clear. It's deep enough to jump in and swim. You and just a handful of friends. It wasn't too huge. You could see straight to the bottom, probably about 10 to 15 feet deep. Just incredible, right? This little oasis in the middle of the desert. And off to one side of this pool was this low spot where a little stream trickled out off into the desert. And if you know anything about water, then you know that that's a really important part of this pool. Water needs to have somewhere to go. Where water comes from is really important. It's crucial to the health and the quality of the water, but where it goes is also very important. Because if water doesn't have anywhere to go, then it becomes stagnant. It becomes gross very quickly. That's what's wrong with the Dead Sea. The Jordan River is this river that travels south through the Middle East, and and it goes in and out of the Sea of Galilee, this picture that you have here. Wherever the river goes is a blessing. The Jordan River, everywhere it goes, is this blessing to the land around it. Everything is flourishing. Everything looks nice until the Jordan empties into the Dead Sea. And that same water that's a blessing everywhere else has a very different story when it reaches the Dead Sea. In the Dead Sea, you're not going to find any fish, not much plant life. Nothing really can live there. It's extremely salty, useless water. The same water that's a blessing becomes useless because nothing flows out of the Dead Sea. It's stagnant. Water comes in carrying all the stuff that water carries, but there's nowhere for water to go out and continue taking those things back out. You've probably seen something like that here in Kentucky. Maybe you've got a pond on your property, or maybe you know of like a drainage ditch in your neighborhood. I don't know. You've seen water come into an area but not have any way for it to be able to exit that area. And things start growing in that water uncontrollably. And it gets out of hand. Maybe it's a pond that's covered in algae. Maybe your pond turns into like a mosquito nursery, right? Maybe it's a drainage ditch that has a stench to it. Water that doesn't have somewhere to go becomes gross. And this isn't about water. I'm talking about people, specifically Jesus' followers. Christians who are consumers only start looking like the Dead Sea or your local pond or that drainage ditch. Blessings are pouring into their lives because that's what God does. He pours into your life. But if Jesus' followers only receive blessings from God but refuse to ever give blessings out, then you start looking very unhealthy. You start looking like a mosquito factory. And that's what Jesus called out in those people who wanted breakfast. They only cared about being fed, and they hadn't made the turn towards believing in Jesus for anything more than their chef. If they had, if they would have seen Jesus as their Messiah, then they would have heard his words, and they would have cared about his message, and they would have hopefully turned a corner. And it wouldn't have been just about being fed. Maybe they would have thought about how they could feed each other. Let's go back to this verse that Doc introduced to us this morning. Paul quotes Jesus as saying it's more blessed to give than to receive. Now, one of the really fascinating things about this is that we don't know where Jesus said this. We don't have a record of it. It's not in the Gospels. And Paul, the guy who's quoting Jesus, we don't have any record of him ever hearing Jesus teach. It's possible, but we don't have proof of it. We don't ever have anything putting Paul on the scene of any of the things that's taught in the Gospels. It's not necessarily a problem. First of all, Jesus taught for years. And if you take the entirety of Jesus' teachings in the Gospels, you could probably read them in just a couple hours. In fact, John, at the end of his Gospel, points out that he doesn't even come close to recording everything. He says there's not enough pens, not enough ink, not enough paper. It's not going to happen. He says that all this stuff that's not there. And so the Gospels are not a comprehensive list of everything Jesus taught. And secondly, Paul sat at the feet of men who had lived with Jesus for those years while he was teaching. And Paul learned from them. He sat at their feet for years. He heard and he received everything that he possibly could of Jesus, including some things that probably don't show up in the gospel accounts, maybe even words like these. And so we may not be able to point at this specific time and place where Jesus said it's more blessed to give than to receive, but man, those words, I think they perfectly sum up Jesus' ethic. Jesus is all about generosity. Giving and being generous aligns us with God's generous nature. It's who God is. It's what God does. Giving and being generous is being like God. Giving and being generous is being like Jesus. And Jesus says that it's better to be a giver than to be a receiver. It's better to be a conduit of blessing to the people around us than to be a consumer of blessings. Do you believe that? It's kind of a hard thing to believe. It's not what our intuition says. It's not what we would assume. Why is it more blessed to give than to receive? Why is giving more blessed? There's a few potential answers here. Maybe Maybe just practically speaking, giving reflects God's character. And anytime any of us try to live like Jesus, that's going to be to our benefit. And if you're living in the nature of Jesus, then you're also going to combat some issues, some natures that you have that aren't in Jesus, some things that exist in us that we need to get rid of. And so giving will combat, like selfishness. It's going to cultivate gratitude. That's a good, positive thing. Maybe that's it. Maybe that's the blessing. Or maybe it's more blessed because giving makes you feel good, kind of like an endorphin or a dopamine rush type of a thing. And sometimes that can be true, but sometimes that isn't true. Sometimes serving or giving or caring for other people doesn't bring satisfaction. It can actually be quite painful. And so maybe there's blessing there, but there has to be something bigger than that, a bigger idea behind what it means to be more blessed. That word blessed is makarios. The same word you see in the Beatitudes with that refrain over and over and over again of blessings. Makarios has this idea of flourishing under God's favor. That's what Doc pointed out earlier. Has the idea that you're flourishing, has this idea that people be more blessed, that people experience more flourishing under God's favor when they live a life that gives, not just receives. You'll thrive in life in a way that you wouldn't have otherwise if you can become a giver. Which is, again, not at all intuitive. We think getting things is where the blessing exists. We think we're blessed when we have lots. But Jesus says you are more blessed to give, not just to receive. And that word makarios, it also has this idea of being joy-filled. Some people think joy and just another word for happiness, but that's not the same. Happiness is a fleeting feeling that can disappear quickly. Joy is much more robust. It's long-lasting. Joy is finding a satisfaction in life that even when things don't work out the way you want them to, that there's something to still be joyful about. And I think what Paul is saying, and I think what Jesus is saying, is that giving people are more joy-filled people. People who aren't obsessed with the self, but instead find ways to give to others, are carrying around a more robust joy. People are more satisfied when blessings flow into their life and out of their life than they are if they would just hoard those blessings to themselves. More flourishing, more joy, more blessings. They'll look more blessed, like the Sea of Galilee or like the Jordan River. The blessings they receive flow out instead of being hoarded to themselves like the Dead Sea. It's more flourishing, it's more joy, it's more blessings. Now, if you're a Jesus follower who's not experienced this truth, this idea that it's more blessed to give than to receive, then it's probably time for you to hear some harsh truth. There's maybe nicer ways that I could say it, but I'll just say it this way. It's time for you to grow up. It's time for you to mature. It's time for you to move past being a consumer. Maturity sees yourself as a conduit for the goodness of God into this world. You receive God's blessings so that you can be used to release God's blessings. You're not supposed to hoard them. You're supposed to pass them on. And I think there's several ways that we can do this. It might be a financial thing. That's kind of what we've been talking about. We've been focused on the financial part of this series we're calling Plus 5. It's all about our relationship with money. And the way that a Jesus follower looks at money should be shifted by what Jesus teaches. I hope that you're growing in that understanding. I hope the idea of Plus 5 that we've been teaching the last few weeks is resonating with you and that you're working through how to grow in your giving to God, because I think that's a really big part of this idea. It's more blessed to give than to receive. In fact, I bet that if you've ever received charity, then I bet you know that you felt more blessed when you gave charity. I felt that. But this is a much bigger deal than just something financial. I think it can start with your finances, but there's so much more that God has blessed us with that we can respond to in giving, like your giftedness. We're going to talk about this more next week, but all of us are gifted with some sort of a talent that can be utilized by Jesus in his kingdom. What's really interesting to me is that God doesn't give us our talents for our benefit or our blessing. It's not for you. Your talents exist for the purpose of blessing others. Do you believe that? Do you believe that that it is more blessed to be used by God to serve others than to be served by others? If you do, if you can believe that, then your giftedness is one of those things that you ought to be pouring into the lives of the people around you. Maybe you have something relational to offer. Maybe you need to offer up some forgiveness. We talk about this every once in a while, but I promise you that you will be blessed by choosing to forgive someone else. In fact, oftentimes the lack of forgiveness wounds the person who's been offended. When you're withholding forgiveness, you're not hurting someone else, you're just hurting yourself. And so forgive them, and it's going to bless them, right? But it's also going to bless you. Maybe you need to listen or bear someone else's burdens. It's so much harder to listen than to talk. We talked about that just a few weeks ago as well. We said this way, we said being heard is so close to being loved that it's almost indistinguishable. If you could just listen, you would offer an incredible blessing into other people's lives. I think that phrase, it's more blessed to give than to receive, is played out in real life in the idea of listening. Now, maybe it's not financial, maybe it's not your giftedness, maybe it's not the relational thing, maybe it's even something spiritual. Maybe it takes you back to our just one emphasis. Maybe you have the gospel message and there are people in your life who need it. I'm telling you right now, man, it is more blessed to give that away. It's more exciting to bring someone to Jesus than to even experience it yourself. Maybe you need to remember your ping pong ball and you need to remember the people that you've been praying for. Maybe you need to get serious about inviting people to church. Maybe you need to get serious about trying to fill this number one up, which we're still leaving up here. I want you guys to get serious about inviting people to church and leading people to Jesus. I'll say this, if you will give, whether that's financially or your giftedness or your relationships or even something bigger like salvation, guys, if you'll give, you're going to find incredible blessing. You're going to take on Jesus' character, and that's always a win. You're going to fight against the negative characteristics that try to drag you down, like selfishness, and that's a win. You're going to find flourishing under God's favor. Blessings are going to show up that you don't even expect, and that's a win. You're going to find joy in how your life has changed, and you're going to find joy in how the lives of the people around you have changed, and that's a win. I mean, could you imagine? Can you imagine a church that's filled with Jesus followers who believe and live out the idea that it's more blessed to give than to receive? Most Christians and most churches don't look like that. Most churches look like preppers camps where they're hoarding resources and stuff for themselves. I want to be a part of something different. Can you imagine a church that lives out being conduits of God's blessings into the community around them? It's the kind of church I want to be a part of. Wouldn't you love to be a part of a group of people who are focused on how to bless the world around them, not just to obtain as many blessings from God for themselves? Go back to where we started. Guys, a healthier marriage is made up of two people who are pouring blessings into one another, not just simply trying to find where the other person should be blessing them. Which is why giving is good for your marriages, and why giving is good for your family. And it's why giving is good for your workplace, and giving is good for your neighborhood, and giving is good for your church, and giving is good for your community. And I hope that if you can hear all those things, that you'll also recognize then that giving is good for you. You don't have to believe it for it to work. In fact, I dare you to try it. I dare you to try being generous and see if blessings don't just show up in ways that you don't expect. I dare you to try giving what you have to bless others. I promise you, you'll walk away more blessed. And I want to pray that over you. Why don't you stand with me? Let's pray that we would be that kind of a people.